They didn't forget you. They filed you. That's the part most people never realize about avoidant attachment. When the connection ends or the distance becomes permanent, avoidants rarely erase the bond. They don't suddenly become emotionally empty. They don't simply move on overnight. Instead, they do something quieter, something psychological. They place the relationship somewhere inside their mind, and they close the drawer, not destroyed, not resolved, just stored, because the avoidant nervous system does not survive emotional overwhelm by processing everything. It survives by compartmentalizing. And once a bond has been placed in that mental container, it can stay there for a very long time, sometimes years, not active, not gone, just filed. Most people think emotional healing requires processing, talking, feeling, understanding, revisiting the past until the emotions settle. For many attachment styles, that process happens naturally. Pain appears, questions appear, memories return. The mind tries to make sense of what happened, but the avoidance system works very differently. It was built to reduce emotional intensity as quickly as possible, not by processing everything, by containing it, because intense emotions create instability. Instability creates pressure, and pressure is something avoidants are wired to escape. So when a relationship ends or becomes too emotionally complex, the mind looks for a faster form of regulation, containment, instead of replaying the memories again and again. The mind organizes them. Instead of sitting inside the emotional pain, the mind reduces access to it. Instead of asking why everything happened, the system moves forward, not through closure, through compartmentalization. The relationship becomes a memory category, a chapter that is no longer active. This is why avoidance can sometimes appear unaffected by breakups or distance or endings, not because they never cared, but because the emotional file has already been closed. From the outside, this looks like detachment, like indifference, like someone who moved on quickly, but internally, something very different has happened. The emotional material has been placed behind a psychological boundary, stored, separated from the present moment. Because if the bond remained emotionally active, the nervous system would constantly revisit it, feel it, question it, re-experience it. And for someone who regulates through autonomy, that kind of emotional loop feels overwhelming. So the mind chooses containment instead. The memories stay, the emotions stay, but access becomes limited. They exist in a mental compartment, and compartments serve a very specific purpose. They keep complex emotions from interfering with daily stability. Work continues, life continues, new experiences appear. The old relationship no longer dominates the emotional landscape. This doesn't mean the bond disappeared. It means the bond is no longer active. In the present, avoidants often do this without realizing it. It's not a conscious decision to forget someone. It's a nervous system strategy, a way to maintain equilibrium without emotional overload. Think of it like a library. Thousands of books exist inside the building, but only a few are open on the table. Most remain on the shelves, quiet, stored, available, but not being read. Relationships can become one of those books, a completed volume, placed back into the archive, still part of the collection, still real, but no longer influencing every moment of daily life. And that is why avoidants sometimes appear to move forward so easily. They did not erase the story. They simply returned it to the shelf. But here is where things become interesting. Because filing something away does not mean it disappears forever. It simply means it is no longer active until something opens the drawer again. A memory, a message, a moment of nostalgia, a shift in life circumstances. Suddenly the file becomes visible again. And that is when people sometimes see something confusing. The avoidant, who seemed completely over it, suddenly remembering, reflecting, sometimes even reaching out. Not because they just started caring again, but because the compartment was opened and everything stored inside it became accessible. Once more, understanding this mechanism changes how you interpret avoidant behavior. They didn't forget you. They contained you inside a psychological space designed to protect their emotional stability. And the moment you realize that, the silence starts looking very different. To understand why avoidants compartmentalize, you have to understand how their nervous system learned to survive. Because this pattern did not begin in adulthood, it began much earlier, in environments where emotional needs did not always receive safe responses, where vulnerability sometimes created discomfort, where expressing feelings did not always lead to closeness. Instead, it sometimes led to distance, disapproval, silence, or emotional overwhelm from caregivers themselves. And when a child experiences that pattern repeatedly, their nervous system adapts, not through rebellion, not through confrontation, through emotional self-containment. They learn something quietly. Emotions must be managed internally. Dependence must be limited. Closeness must be regulated. Because relying too heavily on emotional bonds can feel unpredictable. So the mind builds a protective structure, compartmentalization, a way to organize feelings without becoming overwhelmed by them. Instead of allowing every emotional experience to mix together, the system separates them. Work emotions in one space, family emotions in another, romantic emotions in another. And when one area becomes too intense, it can be sealed off temporarily. This skill becomes a form of regulation, a way to continue functioning without emotional chaos. And in many parts of life, it works extremely well. Avoidance can remain calm during conflict, focused under pressure, independent in difficult moments. But the same mechanism that creates that strength also shapes how they handle romantic bonds. Because romantic relationships carry a unique emotional intensity, they combine vulnerability, attachment, expectation, shared future. And when a relationship ends or becomes unstable, all those emotional layers arrive at once. For someone who processes emotionally, this creates grief, reflection, sometimes long periods of emotional digestion. But the avoidance system seeks a faster route to stability, containment. Instead of sitting inside the emotional storm, the mind organizes it. This relationship goes into a compartment. The memories are stored there. The emotions are sealed with them. And the door closes. Not forever, just enough to restore balance. From the outside, this can feel shocking because the shift appears sudden. One moment, the connection mattered. The next moment, they seem unaffected. But internally, the mechanism is precise. The relationship was not erased. It was categorized, placed somewhere. The nervous system can control access to. Think of it Like closing a laptop, the files remain. Inside the device, nothing disappears, but the screen is no longer open. You cannot see what is stored there. You cannot access it in the moment, yet the information still exists. Avoidants often do this without conscious awareness. They simply feel a need to move forward, to restore calm, to prevent the past from destabilizing the present. And compartmentalization allows them to do that. But emotional compartments have an interesting quality. They are not permanent. They are sealed until something activates them. A memory, a familiar place, a message, a period of loneliness, or even seeing someone who reminds them of the relationship. Suddenly the file reappears, not as a vague thought, as a fully intact memory, because nothing inside was truly processed. It was preserved, stored exactly as it existed when the door closed. And this is why avoidants sometimes experience delayed emotions, feelings that appear months or years later, moments where a memory feels surprisingly vivid, almost untouched by time, because the emotional material never dissolved. It simply waited in containment. Understanding this mechanism reveals something important. Avoidants do not forget people as easily as it seems. They simply protect themselves by placing emotional bonds inside psychological containers, spaces where the past cannot interfere with present stability. And once you understand that, their silence begins to look less like indifference and more like a nervous system trying to maintain order inside a very complex emotional landscape. Compartmentalization does something very specific. It preserves the past without letting it interfere with the present. For the avoidant nervous system, this creates stability. Life keeps moving. Work continues. New routines form. New relationships may even appear. From the outside, it can look like they moved on completely. But internally, the past relationship still exists, just not in the open. It sits in a psychological container, a closed drawer, inside the emotional system. And the key thing about drawers is that they are designed to be opened and closed. Most of the time, the avoidant keeps it closed because opening it would bring back a wave of emotional material, memories, conversations, moments of closeness, unfinished questions, and unfinished emotions. But as long as the drawer remains closed, their emotional equilibrium stays intact. This is why avoidance can appear calm, even after significant endings. They are not constantly revisiting the relationship. They are not replaying every conversation. They are not sitting inside unresolved emotions. Their nervous system has already stored the bond, filed, contained, separated from daily life. But emotional containers have one important limitation. They preserve everything exactly as it was when the door closed. Nothing inside them gets processed over time. Nothing dissolves gradually. Nothing evolves through reflection. It simply waits. This is why, when a compartment opens, the emotions can feel surprisingly fresh. Sometimes years later, a familiar place, a song, a random memory, or even seeing your name appear on their phone. And suddenly, the past relationship is not just a thought, it becomes vivid again. The feelings return, almost intact, because they were never fully processed. They were preserved, and that preservation can create confusing moments. The avoidant, who seemed completely unaffected, suddenly remembering details, moments of nostalgia, occasional curiosity about your life. sometimes even a quiet urge to reconnect, not because the feelings just appeared, but because the file was briefly reopened and everything inside it became visible again. Most avoidants will close the drawer once more, not out of cruelty, but because revisiting the entire emotional bond can feel destabilizing. The past begins touching the present again. Old emotions return, questions return, and the nervous system prefers order. So containment restores that order. The drawer closes. Life continues. But the bond was never erased. This is why some avoidants remember relationships with surprising clarity, even after long periods of silence, because the memories were never worn down by constant emotional processing. They were protected inside containment, almost like a photograph, stored in an album, untouched by sunlight, unfaded by time, still intact, still recognizable, just not displayed on the wall anymore. Understanding this changes how you interpret avoidant distance. Silence does not always mean someone forgot. Moving forward does not always mean the bond disappeared. Sometimes it means the relationship was simply placed somewhere. The nervous system could manage it safely. A compartment designed to hold complex emotional material without letting it spill into the present. And that quiet mechanism is why many people misread avoidant endings. They assume the bond was erased, when in reality, it was carefully filed away. Once you understand compartmentalization, the silence begins to look different. What once felt like indifference starts looking more like containment, because avoidants rarely erase emotional bonds. They store them, not in the center of their daily life, but in a controlled space, inside their mind, a place where the past cannot disrupt their emotional stability. And stability is the priority for the avoidant nervous system, not resolution, not deep emotional processing. Stability, the ability to keep moving without being pulled back into overwhelming emotions. So when a relationship ends or becomes too complex, the system organizes it. This relationship goes here. These memories go with it. These feelings belong in the same place. The drawer closes, and daily life continues. Work, friends, routine, new experiences. From the outside, it may look like they moved on quickly, but internally, the emotional material still exists. It is simply not active, not revisited every day, not constantly examined, just stored. And the purpose of storage is control. Control over when something is accessed, control over when it remains closed. Because emotional autonomy is how avoidants maintain equilibrium. Too much emotional exposure creates pressure. Too much emotional pressure creates withdrawal. So the system learns to organize emotions carefully. This does not mean the bond was meaningless. It means the bond was placed somewhere safe. But understanding this reveals something important. Containment is not the same as resolution. When emotions are processed, they slowly transform. They lose intensity. They gain understanding. They settle. But when emotions are compartmentalized, they remain preserved, almost exactly as they were, which means they can reappear unexpectedly. A memory during a quiet moment, a place that reminds them of you, a message they suddenly think about sending, not because the past is controlling them, but because the drawer opened briefly, and for a moment, everything inside it became visible again. Many avoidants will close that drawer once more, not out of coldness, out of habit, because their nervous system is trained to maintain order. But the important truth remains the same. They did not forget you. They organized the experience in a way that allowed them to keep moving forward. And that understanding changes something important for you. It shifts the focus away from their silence, away from wondering whether they ever cared, away from trying to decode what their distance means. Because once a relationship enters that compartment, you are no longer inside their daily emotional landscape. You exist in a preserved memory, a stored experience, part of their past. And the real question stops being whether they remember you. The real question becomes something far more important. What place does that relationship hold in your present? Because emotional freedom does not come from knowing whether someone filed you away. It comes from deciding how much space that story still occupies in your life. Understanding avoidant patterns is powerful. It reveals the psychology behind confusing behavior. It explains the silence, the distance, the emotional containment. But clarity should never trap you inside the past. It should return you to yourself, your boundaries, your direction, your emotional autonomy. And once you reclaim that center, the question of whether someone compartmentalized you loses its power, because your life is no longer waiting inside someone else's drawer. If this video helped you see avoidant attachment from a deeper psychological perspective, make sure you subscribe to the Inner Odyssey, because here we don't just talk about relationships, we explore the hidden nervous system patterns that shape human connection. And once you understand those patterns, you stop chasing explanations for confusing behavior and start moving through relationships with clarity.